3 of the 4 editors of this widely acclaimed book about Pakistan and the ongoing situation. The title of the book is Faith-Based Violence and Deobandi Militancy in Pakistan. So I'm sitting down with 3 of the 4 editors. I guess I want to begin with, if all 3 of you could comment on what motivated this project and what really inspired you to put out this important text about Pakistan and the ongoing situation there.
Thank you, Caleb, for having us with my colleagues Edwina, Tahir, Kamran, Abbas, Zaidi, and myself, all 4 of us. In 2015, we sat together and we identified that we were not happy and satisfied with the current discourse on terrorism. We identified that in the mainstream media, as well as academic scholarship, there was a gap. There were sweeping and generalizing statements which were, in fact, blurring the picture of terrorism and militancy, which is currently emanating from the world of Islam. We were able to identify something which we thought that terrorism is not. And that misidentification is rooted in our perspective, and that is something which we have tried to offer through this book, in 4 or 5 false binaries. And those binaries are that number 1, terrorism is an issue which is Islam versus West. So create a dichotomy that it is Islam versus West, which is the main cause, a root cause of terrorism. So that is first false binary. The second false binary which we identified was that it is Muslim versus Christians, or Muslim versus Jews, or Muslim versus Hindus, so Muslim versus non-Muslim. So that binary is often produced and recycled in mainstream media. We also wanted to depart from this false binary. We do not agree with this binary. The third binary was the Sunni versus Shia binary. That terrorism is happening in the world because Sunnis and Shias, they are fighting with each other. And we had a problem with this binary because the majority of victims of terrorism worldwide, right from Pakistan to Africa to Iraq to Middle East and other countries, the majority of victims, they happen to be Sunni Muslims. So indeed, that is not really a Sunni versus Shia binary.
Sure, that doesn't fit the narrative.
That doesn't fit the narrative. And another false binary which we identified was that terrorism is a reaction of the have-nots against the haves. That those who are more developed are those who are more prosperous. They are facing terrorism at the hands of those who are the have-nots. And indeed, there are many examples, right from 9/11 hijackers, who were very well off. 9 out of 11 were Saudi citizens, and indeed, they were not amongst the have-nots. And there are many other examples. In Pakistan, we even have some incidents where people from middle class or upper middle class families, educated from some of the top-ranking institutions, they have been involved in acts of terrorism. So that is something. So these were the binaries which we wanted to confront, and we thought that it is extremely important to identify the ideological roots of terrorism. So it was important to isolate extremist ideology and the extremist sections from mainstream Muslims. And when we use this word mainstream Muslims, we would like to isolate terrorists who emanate from, but do not represent the majority of, who emanate from Deobandi tradition within Pakistan, but on a global scale they emanate from Wahhabi and Salafi tradition. That's not to say that the majority of Deobandis or Salafis or Wahhabis, they happen to be extremists. No. They happen to be as moderate Muslims or as moderate human beings as anyone else. But unfortunately, almost all of the terrorists in the world today, including in Pakistan, they happen to be either from Deobandi, Salafi, or Wahhabi tradition. And that's where we thought that it is extremely important that we have to identify and then we have to engage with this group.
Well, thank you very much for that explanation. Now, I wanted to move on to Tahir. You were saying, I know we hear this term radical Islam constantly in the media. We say the problem is radical Islam, that people say there's something separate about the Islamic faith, or they demand that Muslims denounce terrorism. And we also hear this point about a clash of civilizations. We hear that it's said that, you know, the way we live in the West is just so different than the way people live in other parts of the world. But it seems that you've pointed out that what seems to be the issue is not so much a clash of civilizations, but rather a clash within civilizations. Can you explain this point?
Yes, well, when I was working on this Shia-Sunni piece, chapter of this book, what I found out through the texts that various Deobandi scholars have produced, that the rhetoric against the Shias was quite pronounced, which remained blurred and which remained a bit, which remained hidden till the British were ruling subcontinent. But after 1949, that year I consider very important so far as the Pakistani history is concerned, because Deobandis started coming to the political forefront from 1949 onwards. They regrouped because they were in opposition to the creation of Pakistan, but when Pakistan was created, they regrouped, they redefined their ideology somewhat, and then they started a campaign against Ahmadis and afterwards Shias. So it was a particular group that was peddling that ideology against the Shia minority, which was quite influential in some areas of Pakistan. So when I looked at the global scale through Saudi Arabia, that ideology was casting a profound influence, the particular version of Quran was distributed in Tajikistan in 1989, and that particular version of Quran was produced by Saudi Arabia, and that was essentially anti-Shia. So that phenomenon that I consider as clash within the civilization, and that's the biggest challenge. It's not Islam versus West, but what Muslims have to address first of all is these are some of the groups and factions which are berating other factions and declaring them or denouncing them as anti-Muslims or non-Muslims, and Shias are very, very important component of Islam and Muslims at large, because if you see from Tajikistan and up to Bahrain, there are a number of countries having sizable Shia presence, like Bahrain itself has 70% of Shias, and that country is ruled by Sunni, and coercive means are employed to sustain that rule. Similarly, Kuwait and Iran and Iraq, of course. Rather 15 to 20% Shias, they live in Saudi Arabia, and wherever they live, that's the main source of oil generation. So there is a dichotomy, sectarian dichotomy within Saudi Arabia. So these are the economic interests, these are some of the vested interests of small groups which have quite a bit of influence, which is generating this false perception among the Muslims that, well, Shias and Sunnis are inveterate enemies of each other. And I have discussed and I have said quite the otherwise, and I argue quite the otherwise, that, well, these are the two different factions having slight differences or discrepant interpretations of the foundation text, but they're one and the same.
Okay. Now, Edwina, you in particular have talked about religious minorities, in particular the Christians, and that their role in this conflict and how they've been treated. Would you like to explain that to our audience?
Yes, sure. I think I got involved in this book as the second co-editor, primarily because I believe in a diversity narrative that I think is very important in any organization, in any country, because it helps to avoid the miniaturization of human beings. And therefore, for example, I could, for example, be a mother, I could be a Muslim or a Christian, I could be a scholar, I could be a person of color, And I could also be someone who might be persecuted by a majority group. But when we say majority group, we need to be very clear that in this particular book, we are highlighting the fact that it is a particular sect. In this example, it's Deobandi militancy in Pakistan. And as my colleague Jawad mentioned, it's not all Deobandis, it's a particular group within there. Now, also my reason for getting involved in this particular project was the fact that all Christians in Pakistan do not come from the lower socioeconomic status, though the majority do come. They were converted from Hindus, and they were the lowest caste system among Hindus. Unfortunately, not much of that has changed. However, there were also a number of Christians who migrated from the then Portuguese controlled Goa in India to Pakistan. And many of them achieved very high status in the Pakistan government, in the military, composing the national anthem, as Olympic sports players in Pakistan. Somehow that gets erased. And when we talk of Christians in Pakistan, it's also important to remember that they don't feel safe because of blasphemy laws. And blasphemy laws could be put into effect because one wants the property of a particular place, one wants certain members of the family of a particular place. It could be a woman, for example. And there's very little to prevent them, that's the Christians, from really saying, we want to live in peace, we want to live in harmony. We've coexisted with Muslims for centuries, and there hasn't been a problem. So it's the overall macrocosm looking at Muslims as a broad brush canvas, rather than saying it's specific people who are doing this particular terrorism and atrocities.
Now, before we conclude, I would like all three of you to comment, because it seems like one of the underlying issues in American politics right now is our relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Donald Trump was highly critical of Saudi Arabia during his campaign. He called out Hillary Clinton for the fact that she had received Saudi support for her foundation. He talked against them, but then we see him recently going on his trip to Saudi Arabia, dancing with the Saudi king. And we've heard a lot of talk about Saudi Arabia's role in spreading the Wahhabi ideology and the Wahhabi perspective. And I would like the three of you to touch on Saudi Arabia's role and Saudi Arabia's role in Pakistan and in what's being described as this clash within civilizations. Could the three of you do that? Would that be all right?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Well, I'm personally quite critical of Saudi Arabia's role in Pakistan, and particularly the version and the discourse particularly prevalent among the upper echelons of American politics and government. Because Saudi Arabia is peddling a peculiar version of Islam, which is a minority version, and which is a historical version, and which is very, very scriptural in its essence. So just because of the oil money, various religious seminaries or madrasas are being set up, and in the name of countering influence, Shia influence from Iran, it has been meddling into the affairs of Pakistan, and since it has vast resources, oil and mineral resources, so whole of the world listens to Saudi Arabia, including President Donald Trump.
Indeed, we are running short on time, but if the other two of you would like to comment just quickly on Saudi Arabia, and then we will conclude.
Yes.
So
I think I'd just like to mention the fact that if we say, as my colleague Tahir mentioned, that Saudi Arabia can have such a major influence, it could also have a major influence on gender. And gender becomes a very critical aspect when one looks at the fact that many people feel that Muslims subjugate their women totally. So they could also be a very powerful influence in saying that Islam does not really say that women need to be subjugated. Women have freedom, women could start their own business, they could choose to decide what they want to wear and what they want to do and how they perform Islam.
I think over the last few years, a few decades, at least some sections within Saudi government and establishment, they have also to some extent realized that there has to be some control over extremist Wahhabism. Saudi Arabia and some of its own government ministers and princes, they have been victim of terrorism. And recently we have seen, only yesterday, that there was a failed attack on the main mosque, Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. So indeed, this extremist Wahhabism or extremist Devbandiism or Takfirism, it is sparing no one. And Saudi government and establishment, they also have to be more aware of this. They should be engaged in a constructive manner. Iran should be engaged. All other countries, they have to be engaged that these extremists, they do not represent any community, they do not represent any religion, but that doesn't mean they do not follow an ideology. That ideology and the extremist streaks within that ideology, they have to be identified, they have to be engaged, they have to be educated, and sometimes legal and punitive action also have to be taken.
And Iran should be taken on board. You know, that will be a huge step forward in the right direction.
Well, I do thank you all for making these points, and I feel like if Americans are going to understand, as they increasingly become afraid of terrorist attacks, if they're going to understand the threat that they're facing, they really need to come to understand the issues that you describe here in this text. So I really do thank you all for the opportunity to sit down. The book is called Faith-Based Violence and Deobandi Militancy in Pakistan. I know I'm going to be getting a copy before I go, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Captain.
Thank you very much.